Hey, fourth and fifth graders. We are going to have story time today, and we are going to read two chapters out of our storytime book, and I want to finish it yet this week, so I'm going to plan to do this another day this week as well. In some way, probably read the last. There's 4 total chapters left, so read the last 2 another day. So you can pretend that you're sitting here with me, like I wish you would be, and listen to the story. Hopefully, you can hear me okay. And our next chapter is called Hickory Dickory Dock. Little did we know when we read our last chapter that we wouldn't be reading together again, but we can at least finish hearing what the story is about. Now you all got a turn taking JoJo home for the week, which is great. Hopefully you had fun. Hopefully he had fun and wasn't too terrified. So I think that's awesome. We got that idea out of this book. And we want to finish up reading about Humphrey. So, 2 chapters today. Sit down, grab a cup of tea or hot chocolate if you want to, since you can do that if you want to, and I will read. So, next chapter, chapter 12, Hickory Dickory Dock. Friday morning, I was tired and a little jumpy because I thought Mrs. Brisbane might be upset that I mixed up her cards. I was also worried about Harry. All week long, I'd held my breath after every bell, wondering if Hurry Up Harry would be tardy or not. After all, he made a deal with Mrs. Brisbane. He did unsqueakably well at keeping his end of the bargain. But on Thursday, he had been late to school because his mom couldn't find her car keys. They were under the kitchen table. I wasn't sure whether he'd broken his end of the deal or not, so I still didn't know where I'd be spending the weekend. But I forgot about everything else when Mrs. Brisbane said, "Boys and girls, I'm now going to announce your new classroom jobs." She explained Brisbane's buddies and how the students would work in pairs. Then she described each job. Finally, she began to read off the names of the students who would share each job. For homework collectors, Rosie and Phoebe. Mrs. Brisbane looked surprised, and I knew why. The night before, I'd moved Phoebe to the homework job. Helpful Holly raised her hand. "Don't you think I should do the job with Rosie?" "No," Mrs. Brisbane said. "I have another job for you, Holly. Just keep listening." Holly looked disappointed, but Mrs. Brisbane continued. "Animal handlers will be Joey and Kelsey." Again, Mrs. Brisbane looked surprised. I just hoped that Be Careful Kelsey would be better at taking care of animals than she was at taking care of herself. Joey and Kelsey both looked thrilled. "It really is the best job," I squeaked to Og. "Boing, boing," he agreed. "Door and line monitors will be—" Mrs. Brisbane paused. She obviously knew these weren't the names she'd chosen, but she read them anyway. "Harry and Simon." I thought that pairing Hurry Up Harry with Slow Down Simon was a brilliant idea. At least I hoped so. Mrs. Brisbane kept going. I thought maybe she'd ignore my next idea, but when she read the names, she actually looked pleased. Bulletin board designers, Paul G. and Paul F. The two Pauls did not look thrilled, but I crossed my toes and I hoped my idea would work. When she got to the very end of the list, there were just 2 people left. "These jobs just have one person," she said. "Thomas, you will be class reporter. That means you have to record what we do every day in a class log," she explained. "What we study, who participates, and even what the temperature is. No exaggeration, okay?" "Okay," Thomas said as he gave her a thumbs up. "Holly, you will be the teacher's assistant. That means when I need anything done, from taking a note to the office to answering the phone or cleaning the board, I will ask you. Do you think you can handle that?" Helpful Holly did. Near the end of the day, Mrs. Brisbane made another announcement. Hurry Up Harry would be taking me home for the weekend. "Yes," Harry shouted. "This is my lucky day." I hoped it was my lucky day, too. I was tired from all that late-night work rearranging the cards, but a classroom hamster sometimes works around the clock. And I was anxious to get to Hurry Up Harry's house and meet his family. I had to wait a while, though, because Harry's mom was unsqueakably late in picking us up from the school. Yup, I had my work cut out for me. Again. Harry's mom was nice, nice, nice. So was little sister Susie. I wasn't surprised. After all, Harry was nice, nice, nice. He was also often late, late, late. And I wanted to find out why. I got all settled on the coffee table in the Itto family room. Nice mouthy, Susie said as she leaned in close to my cage. Nice hamster, I politely corrected her. Mouth, she said, twirling in circles around my cage until I felt slightly dizzy. He's a hamster, Harry corrected her. Thank goodness. Susie twirled around again, but this time she said, Hamster! At least that was a little closer than mouth. Usually when I go home with a student, I am placed on a desk or table, admired and played with, and then the family has dinner. At Harry's house, I was placed on a table, admired and played with, but dinner was a long way off. I can't say the Itto family didn't have a clock. They had a large gold one in the living room, on the mantel above the fireplace, directly opposite from my spot on the table. I saw the time change from 6 to 6:30 and from 6:30 to 7 o'clock. Each time the clock reached the half-hour point, it chimed a lovely loud sound. Ding dong, ding dong. Mommy, I'm hungry, Susie said. She stopped twirling and plopped down on the sofa. Sorry, honey, Harry's mom said. I was hoping we'd all eat together. But I'll go ahead and give you some pasta. Pasta, 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 Susie said, jumping up and twirling around my cage again. Harry decided to wait to eat until his dad came home, which was around 8:30. Sorry, Mr. Itto said, giving Harry's mom a kiss, which was unspeakably nice. I was clearing up some paperwork and I lost track of time, he said. The Ittos lost track of time a lot. Harry's mom said it was no problem, and it was 9 when she finally said the food was ready. Susie had fallen asleep on the sofa, but the rest of the family ate together. After dinner, Harry's mom took Susie up to bed, and Harry and his dad came into the living room. Wow, I didn't know it was so late, Mr. Itto said, looking up at the large, shiny gold clock over the fireplace. It's bedtime for you too, Harry. Oh, Dad, it's Friday night. Can't I stay up a little while longer? Harry asked. Harry's dad said it was okay, especially since he'd gotten home late and hadn't had much time with his son. They started playing a game together. I decided to entertain them with some hamster acrobatics. I leaped around on my tree branch, then hopped on my wheel and started spinning faster and faster. Go, Humphrey, go, Harry said, and pretty soon he and his father forgot about their game and watched me. Tomorrow we'll put him in his hamster ball, Harry told his dad. When Harry's mom came back downstairs, I started my act all over again. I was already tired from the night before, but a hamster's job is never done. Mrs. Itto glanced up at the clock. Harry has a soccer game in the morning, she said with a yawn. We'd better get to bed. Mr. Itto looked up at the clock, too. My watch is a little slow, he said, resetting it. Are you sure that clock is right? His wife asked. Very sure. It may be an antique, but it keeps perfect time, Mr. Itto answered. Mrs. Itto nodded, then adjusted her watch, too. After Harry and his parents had gone to bed, I was happy to settle in for a nice snooze myself. Like the Ittos, I checked the clock. It was 11. The next morning, I sat in my cage in the living room and watched the Ittos in action. There was the usual morning commotion of people getting up, eating breakfast, listening to the news. Harry came into the living room to see me. Hi, Humphrey, did you have a good sleep? Do you like my house? He asked. I was about to say yes, when Mrs. Itto rushed into the living room, looking frantic. Harry, you've got to get dressed. The game's at 9, she said. It was only 15 minutes before 9, and Mrs. Itto was still in her robe. What time's the game? Mr. Itto asked, wandering into the living room, still in his robe, too. 9, Mrs. Itto told him as she headed for the stairs. Mr. Itto was right behind her. Harry came back down in his soccer uniform at 5 minutes before 9. I crossed my toes and hoped that the soccer field was close to the house. Finally, Mr. and Mrs. Itto came back into the living room, both dressed. Where's Susie? Mr. Itto asked. Mrs. Itto ran back up the stairs. I'll get her dressed. Meet you in the car. Mr. Itto looked at the clock and shook his head. It was 1 minute before 9. Okay, he said, but we're going to be late. The last Itto finally left the house at 3 minutes past 9. They were definitely late, as usual. I was exhausted from watching the family run around like that, but I realized that this was probably what went on in the Iddo house every day that Harry was late to school. Mr. and Mrs. Iddo were grown up human beings and seemed quite smart. How could a small hamster help them change their ways? I thought about that problem all day between naps in my cage. Then an idea began to take shape in my brain. The Iddos weren't very good at keeping track of the time, but when they did, they seemed to check that clock on the mantel. I couldn't change the Iddos, but maybe I could change the clock they trusted so much. As I stared at the clock a long time, a little rhyme rolled around in my brain. Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. Susie had called me a mouse, at least I think that's what she meant by mouse. And hamsters are a lot like mice. According to Aldo, we're both rodents. So if a mouse could go up the clock, I guess a clever hamster like me could too, as long as I had a plan. I rested some more while the Iddos were gone, knowing I had a busy night ahead of me. Once the family was back from the game, Harry's team won, yay. I learned that the Iddos were really fun as long as they didn't have to worry about the time. Harry showed Susie some of his soccer moves in the backyard. Then they all went out for a while and came back with lots of yummy food. Later, Mr. and Mrs. Iddo cooked a big dinner, and Harry and Susie helped. And they gave me carrots. After dinner, they all went downstairs to the basement, and Harry brought me along. I was glad he did because I got to sit in my cage and watch the family play table tennis. They didn't play tennis with a table. They played it on a table, using a small bouncy ball and paddles. Susie was too young to play, but they gave her a paddle and let her try. Harry and his parents were very good at hitting the ball back and forth across the table, with a little net going down the center. The game was quite exciting, and my neck got tired from turning my head back and forth to follow the ball in its travels. Hey, maybe Humphrey would like to play, Harry said. I shivered and quivered a little bit, worried that the Iddos were going to bat me back and forth with paddles. But Harry had a better idea. First, he put blankets all around the edges of the table so I wouldn't roll off. Then he placed me inside my hamster ball and set it on the table. Go for it, Humphrey, he said. The Iddos all leaned in and watched as I rolled my ball across the table toward the net. I was able to pick up quite a bit of speed. As I hit the net, I bounced off just like the little white ball. Score one for Humphrey, said Harry. Let's give him a point every time he bounces off the net. I don't mean to brag, but I scored 10 points before Harry's mom said she was tired and needed to go to bed. She was tired? What about me? But I still had lots of work to do. Once I was alone in the living room and the house was completely quiet, I opened the lock that doesn't lock and slid down the leg of the coffee table. The moon shone through the big double doors, and I could see that there was a set of metal shelves next to the fireplace. The shelves were spaced close together, which was a lucky break for me because I could easily climb up and hop onto the mantel. I haven't had any experience with clocks, but I hoped that I could figure out how this one worked. It was an old-fashioned clock with numbers and hands, not the kind with lighted numbers. The time was exactly 11:25. There was no way to set the time on the front of the clock, so I moved around to the back. There was a knob there, which I figured must be for setting the time. I reached up and tried to turn the knob to the right. The thing didn't budge. My plan wasn't going to work. I sat back down on the mantel and rested. Wait a minute, Humphrey, I squeaked softly to myself. You turned off rock and a key. Surely you can turn this little knob. I felt very determined as I leaped up and grabbed onto the top of the knob with all my might. I don't weigh much, but I hoped that if I could hang on long enough, I'd be heavy enough to move the knob. I shimmied my body over to the right and tried to yank the knob down. Oof, the knob budged a little bit. Ding, 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 ding. Suddenly the chimes rang out. I dropped back to the mantel. Ding, 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 ding. The chimes were so loud it felt as if they were ringing in my brain. It was enough to give me a huge hamster headache. Still, I had a plan and nothing was going to stop me. The ringing stopped, so I leaped up again, hung on for dear life, and the knob moved a little more. I let go, then scurried around to the front, checked the time, and then returned to the back to move the knob again and again. My paws were aching. When I went around to check the front of the clock again, I saw that I had set the clock ahead 5 minutes. I was afraid to set it too far ahead, then the Iddos might catch on, but maybe 5 minutes would make a difference. Feeling unsqueakably pleased with myself, I looked for a way back to my cage. The thought of climbing down the wire shelves made my stomach a little queasy, but on the other side there was a window with curtains and a long cord hanging down. Perfect. I grabbed onto the cord and began to slide. Eek! I hadn't realized that this cord would be so slippery. I slid way, way, way faster than when I slid down the cord to the blinds in room 26. The room was a blur as I zoomed down to the floor, which I hit a little harder than I would have liked. Once I recovered, I looked up at the clock. It was 11:45 by then. Of course, I knew that it was really only 11:40. I'm so glad I know how to tell time. I had another lucky break when I got back to the coffee table. There was a footstool next to it, and I climbed up easily and hopped back on the table and into my cage. I was never so happy to crawl into my sleeping hut as I was that night. And to think at that moment, Og was alone in room 26, just swimming around in his tank. The next morning, I was a little sore, but anxious to see all my hard work would pay off. It was a little later in the morning when again there was a lot of running back and forth through the living room around 9:45. "We'll be late to church," Mrs. Iddo said, walking into the room in her robe. "I am all set," Mr. Iddo answered. He strolled in, completely dressed for the day. "You make sure the kids are ready," his wife said. "I'll get dressed." Mr. Iddo disappeared, and I could hear footsteps upstairs as the whole family hurried around. They finally reappeared in the living room again, dressed for church. "Oh no, we're going to be late again," Mrs. Iddo said, looking at the clock. "Only 5 minutes late," her husband said. "Let's go." When they left, I looked up at the clock. It said it was 5 minutes to 10, but I knew it was really 10 minutes to 10. The Iddos would probably make it to church on time. Barely. The rest of the day was quiet, quiet, quiet. I was dozing when Harry came and picked up my cage. "Come on, Humphrey," he said. "You can help me with my homework." "Eek," I squeaked. I wasn't upset about the homework. I was upset because I didn't want to end up in Harry's room for the night. I already had a plan to give the Iddos a little more help. Thank goodness, when Harry was finished, he carried my cage back downstairs to the table in the living room. My plan was safe. When the house was quiet that night, after the clock chimed 11 o'clock, I opened the door to my cage, took a deep breath, and once again headed up the wire shelves to the mantel. With great effort, I turned the clock forward another 5 minutes. That would give the Iddos an extra 10 minutes in the morning. Hopefully the next morning I wouldn't be tardy, and neither would Harry. Humphrey's rules of school. Homework can be extremely tiring, especially if you're a classroom pet. Okay, chapter 13. Brisbane versus Becker. Good news. The Iddos never suspected what I'd done. In fact, Mrs. Iddo noticed that the clock was 10 minutes ahead of her watch, so she changed her watch. Mr. Iddo did the same thing. Believe it or not, we got to school 5 minutes ahead of the bell. Harry was surprised, his mother was surprised, and Mrs. Brisbane was surprised. I was not. "Harry, it's great to see you here on time," Mrs. Brisbane said. Mrs. Iddo looked a little embarrassed. "Mrs. Brisbane, I know we got off to a bad start this year," Mrs. Iddo told the teacher, "but I'm really going to do my best to get Harry here on time every single day." That made Mrs. Brisbane happy. I was happy too. I just hope nobody ever changes the clock again. Except for me. I couldn't wait until recess to tell Og about my adventures. But first, something even more important was going on. The students started their new jobs as Mrs. Brisbane's buddies. "Here's hoping my plan worked," I told Og. Rolling Rosie and Forgetful Phoebe went to work right away collecting the homework assignments. The two girls put their homework in first. Yes, Phoebe had actually remembered this time. As I was hoping, she'd probably figured it would look bad, bad, bad for a homework collector to forget her own assignments. Thomas never went anywhere without his class log, which he wrote in a lot. Mrs. Brisbane kept helpful Holly hopping. Holly took attendance and carried the report to the office. Later, Mrs. Brisbane asked Holly to tidy up the little library in the back of the room and water her plants. I think Holly finally got to be as helpful as she wanted. Hurry Up Harry and Slow Down Simon made excellent door and line monitors. When it was time for recess, Simon opened the door and Harry led the students down the hall. He couldn't dawdle if he was first in line. Then Simon closed the door and made sure there were no stragglers at the end of the line, so there was no way for him to race ahead. After lunch, there was free time for Tall Paw and Small Paw to work on the bulletin board. This was the pair I was most interested in, since they never actually talked to each other before. Sorry. I had to fix something there for a bit. It was a little hard for me to see what they were doing. I was in my hamster ball while Mrs. Brisbane watched just Joey clean up my cage. Once she got him started, she moved over to Og's tank to teach "Be careful, Kelsey," how to take care of him. "I hope she's careful with you, Og," I squeaked, knowing that Joey wouldn't be able to understand me. "Boing, boing," Og twanged cheerfully. While Joey was working, he talked to me. "I can't believe it, Humphrey. I got the best job of all. Good things hardly ever happen to me," he said. I'd never seen Joey so happy. As he put me back in my cage, he said, "It's just like having Giggles back. I can hardly wait until you come home with me." "Me either," I squeaked, before I remembered Joey had that frisbee-catching dog. Then I climbed up to the top of my cage to get a better look at the two paws. They were taking down papers and old thumbtacks that were still on the bulletin board. Tall Paw handled the top part of the board, while Small Paw handled the bottom part. They weren't talking to each other, but at least they were working together. Near the end of the day, Mrs. Brisbane called Holly up to her desk and told her that she was doing a wonderful job. "I was thinking, Holly, being my assistant takes up a lot of time. Maybe it would make sense for Phoebe to be Rosie's assistant," she suggested. "After all, they are homework collectors together." Helpful Holly looked relieved. "I think that's a good idea," she said, "if it's okay with Rosie." "I'll ask her," Mrs. Brisbane said. Of course, when she asked Rosie, it was no problem. And when she asked Phoebe to be Rosie's new assistant, Phoebe's face lit up. Yes, my evening rearranging the Brisbane's buddies cards was definitely paying off, and the worst class ever was looking a lot better. I was pretty pleased with myself for a while, but after school something happened that shook me down to the very tips of my paws. Miss Becker paid a visit to room 26. I'd never actually seen Miss Becker before. She was a short woman with great big glasses that made her eyes look huge. That might have been a little weird, but Miss Becker also had a great big smile that made me like her. "I hope you don't mind, Sue," she said as she came in the room. "My students are very anxious for us to get a classroom pet, but I've never had one before." Mrs. Brisbane smiled. "My class was very fond of Humphrey and Og last year." "Oh, I know, that's all I hear. Humphrey this and Og that, that's just about all they talk about," Miss Becker explained. "But I don't know, I never even had a pet as a child." "Why don't you come over and meet them?" Mrs. Brisbane suggested. My heart sank down to the bottom of my toes. Was Mrs. Brisbane really going to give one or both of us away? "I wasn't interested in having a hamster last year either," Mrs. Brisbane said. I remembered that well. "Then Miss Mack brought Humphrey in while I was gone," she continued. He added a lot to the classroom. So when Angie Loomis needed to get Og out of her classroom, I was happy to take him. It's funny because sometimes I think they've actually become friends. Sometimes. Og and I are friends all the time. "But do you have to, touch them?" Miss Becker said. Her big smile had disappeared. "Sure, I do, but I don't mind," she said. Miss Becker leaned in close to my cage, so close her eyes seemed gigantic. "They say Humphrey does many cute things," she said, her voice quivering a little. Mrs. Brisbane chuckled. "I should say so. Show her, Humphrey." I've never been shy about showing off my great gymnastic abilities. After all, it seems to please humans to watch me leaping, spinning, rolling, and climbing, and to hear me say squeak, squeak, squeak. But I was a little nervous about showing off so much that Miss Becker would want to move me to room 18, especially since she didn't even want to touch me. But I always tried to do what Mrs. Brisbane asked, so with a heavy heart I hopped on my wheel and began to spin. "Oh my!" Mrs. Brisbane's big eyes grew even wider. "He's certainly active." She didn't sound too pleased about that, so I decided to be a little more active. I jumped off the wheel and climbed up my tree branch as fast as my little legs could carry me. When I got to the top, I leaped onto the side of the cage. Miss Becker gasped. "How does he do that?" "He's a very clever guy," Mrs. Brisbane said proudly. "But Og is no slouch either," she said. I had a chance to catch my breath while the two teachers turned their attention to Og's tank. "He's a very handsome frog, isn't he?" Mrs. Brisbane asked. Now, I consider Og a very fine fellow, but handsome? With that green skin, no fur at all, the huge mouth, and those big, googly eyes, which suddenly reminded me a lot of Miss Becker's eyes. Boing! Og twanged. It was a pleasant sort of reply, but Miss Becker jumped back from the tank. What was that? She asked. That's the kind of sound he makes. Mrs. Brisbane was being very patient. And what does he do? Mrs. Becker asked. He spends part of his time on the dry part of his tank, and part of his time in the water, Mrs. Brisbane explained. Og must have been listening, with those ears I can't see, because he suddenly leaped into the water and began splashing wildly. Oh my, Miss Becker exclaimed. He's awfully noisy, isn't he? I'd had it then. We'd been very polite to Miss Becker, but she certainly wasn't polite to us. Not as noisy as you are, I squeaked. Miss Becker looked back and forth between Og and me. How do you manage it all? She asked. Oh, the children do most of the work, Mrs. Brisbane said, though I do enjoy bringing them home when I can. I think the point is something Miss Mack told me when she brought Humphrey to room 26. You can learn a lot about yourself by taking care of another species. That's proved to be very true. Miss Becker stared at Og and me for a while before she spoke again. I don't know what to say. The students love them so much. Just then, Miss Mack came in. Am I interrupting something? She asked. No, you're the perfect person to talk to, Mrs. Brisbane said. She was right. Miss Mack was a perfect person, at least to me. Some of my old students are begging for a classroom pet, and Arlene's trying to decide whether to get one, Mrs. Brisbane explained, so she came to look at Humphrey and Og. Miss Mack smiled her wonderful warm smile. Any class would do better with those two. For once, I was sorry Miss Mack had come to visit. I didn't want her to talk Miss Becker into taking me away. Thanks for your time, Sue, Miss Becker said. I still have a lot to think about. After Miss Becker left, Miss Mack wanted to talk to Mrs. Brisbane. It's great to see my students learning to read, she said, but some of them are having a hard time, and I want them to see how much fun books can be. Mrs. Brisbane nodded. That gives me an idea. We could work together. She glanced at the clock. I've got to go now. I'll give you a call tonight and we'll talk. Just before Miss Mack left, she bent down so she was eye level with my cage and Og's tank. Maybe my students need a classroom pet too, she said. Suddenly, I had a sinking feeling that both Og and I would be leaving room 26. When Aldo came in to clean that night, it was clear right away that he was still upset. Richie called and said he thinks one of you is coming to Miss Becker's class, he said. I don't think that's a good idea. Me either, I squeaked loudly. Boing, 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 Og agreed. Of course, those kids love you, he said, calming down as he swept the floor. But the new kids need you too. It was true. Just about everybody seemed to need a helpful hamster. Later that night, after Aldo left and Og was quiet, I slipped my little notebook out from its hiding place and started a couple of lists. Reasons to stay in room 26. Mrs. Brisbane relies on me. The new students have a lot of problems and need help. To stay with Og, I hope. Reasons for me to move to room 18. To be with my old friends, Richie, Heidi, Gail, Kirk, Tabitha, AJ. To teach Miss Becker about pets. Reasons for Og to move to room 18. To be with his old friends, Richie, Heidi, Gail, Kirk, Tabitha, AJ. To teach Miss Becker about pets. I stared at those lists for hours and hours and hours, but I couldn't decide which would be the best choice for me. In the end, I wouldn't make the decision anyway, but just before I tucked my notebook away for the night, I worked on my poem. Autumn, oh autumn, the golden leaves are blowing. Autumn, oh autumn, I don't know where I'm going. Humphrey's Rules of School. Make sure you do your part to make your classroom a better place. Okay, we have 2 more chapters, and hopefully we'll be able to finish that up sometime this week. So, hopefully you were able to hear okay and enjoyed that, and have fun whatever you're doing the rest of today, finishing up your work and everything that you're doing. I will see you later.